captures the grief and heartbreak the songwriter suffered after the loss of his son Connor.
He was saying that he was dead, and I could not let myself believe it.
No more tears in heaven.
At 46 years old, Eric Clapton stood on stage with a song that millions knew, but that he could barely bear to play. Tears in Heaven wasn't just another hit. It wasn't written for radio charts or sold-out arenas.
If I saw you in heaven.
It was written for a little boy who would never come back. The world saw Clapton as a guitar god, a living legend who had already survived addiction, fame, and heartbreak. But nothing prepared him for what happened in March 1991. His 4-year-old son, Connor, died after a tragic fall from a high-rise apartment window in New York City. The details were as shocking as they were heartbreaking, and Clapton would later say that he wrote the song simply to survive his grief. And yet the world kept demanding the song. Audiences wanted to hear it. They sang along, sometimes with tears in their eyes, not realizing that every time Clapton picked up his guitar, he was reopening a wound that never healed. Years later, he made a decision that shocked even his closest fans. At the age of 46, Clapton revealed that the song was too painful, too raw, and that he could no longer perform it live. The silence that followed said more than the music ever could. But why would a man who poured his grief into one of the most beloved ballads of all time suddenly turn away from it? And what did that decision mean for the rest of his life, his career, and his relationship with the son he lost? The truth is more complicated and far more heartbreaking than most people realize. If you want more untold stories behind the songs that shaped our lives, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the bell. This channel is where music's deepest secrets and most emotional moments come to light, stories you won't find anywhere else. By the early 1990s, Eric Clapton had already lived a lifetime of extremes. He was hailed as one of the greatest guitarists of all time. From his early days with the Yardbirds and Cream to his solo career, he had created riffs that defined entire eras. But Clapton was also known for battles off stage, years of drug addiction, alcohol abuse, and turbulent relationships. Somehow, against the odds, he kept going. That sense of hope came from one thing: his young son, Connor. Born in 1986 from Clapton's relationship with Italian model Lori Del Santo, Connor brought a joy Clapton had never experienced before. Friends would later say that Clapton finally looked settled when he was with the boy. For a man whose music had always been filled with longing and searching, this bond felt like healing. But in March 1991, everything changed. Connor, only 4 years old, fell from the 53rd floor window of a New York apartment. The world heard the news through headlines, but Clapton lived it in silence. Later, he would say there were no words for that kind of loss. And when words finally came, they weren't spoken, they were written into music. From that grief, Tears in Heaven was born. But while the world embraced the song as healing, for Clapton, performing it was the opposite. Each note dragged him back to that day. Each lyric forced him to relive the moment he could never forget. So what do you do when the song that defines your pain also becomes the song the world refuses to let you escape? Clapton had to find his own answer. In March 1991, Eric Clapton's life was ripped apart when his 4-year-old son Connor fell from a 53rd floor apartment window in New York City. The tragedy left him numb. For months he avoided the stage, the studio, and even friends. Music, the very thing that had always carried him, suddenly went silent. But in that silence, something began to stir. Clapton felt he needed a way to express what words couldn't capture. He reached out to songwriter Will Jennings, asking him to help shape his grief into music. Jennings hesitated. He later admitted he wasn't sure it was right to turn such raw loss into a song. But Clapton insisted. He didn't want a hit. He needed a lifeline. The lyrics they wrote together were painfully direct. Would it be the same? If I Saw You in Heaven wasn't a poetic flourish. It was Clapton's own desperate question. He said later that singing the words felt almost impossible, but writing them was the only way he knew to keep breathing. At first, the song was played quietly, almost privately. At a small benefit concert for children's hospitals, Clapton performed it with trembling hands. The crowd wept openly, sensing they were witnessing something deeply personal. Soon after, the song appeared on the soundtrack of the film Rush, that gave it its first broad exposure, but it was MTV Unplugged in 1992 that changed everything. Sitting with an acoustic guitar, Clapton delivered the song so softly it felt like a whisper to his son. The performance went viral before viral even existed. Millions connected with it. The recording swept the Grammys, winning Record of the Year, Song of the Year, and Best Male Pop Vocal Performance. What began as a father's cry became one of the most beloved ballads of its time. But for Clapton, success came with a hidden cost. Each time he played it, the wound reopened. The world quickly claimed Tears in Heaven as its own. Fans from every corner of the globe wrote letters to Clapton, thanking him for giving them a way to grieve. Parents who had lost children said it was the only song that gave voice to their pain. Couples played it at funerals. Churches used it in vigils. At his concerts, audiences began waiting for that single moment, the hush before the opening notes, the collective intake of breath, the tears that followed. For them, it was a release. For Clapton, it was torture. He later admitted that while he was moved by how the song touched people, performing it was agony. Each time he sang it, he relived March 20, 1991. Again, by the mid-1990s, demand became relentless. Promoters insisted on it. TV appearances required it. Even journalists seemed to ask about nothing else. Tears in Heaven wasn't just a song anymore, it was the centerpiece of every show. His fellow musicians noticed the toll. Some recalled that Clapton's face seemed to tighten whenever he played it, his body bracing for impact. The song had saved him once, but now it was dragging him down. As the years passed, Clapton's personal life shifted. He remarried, welcomed new children, and began to find stability. But with every performance of Tears in Heaven, he felt pulled back into the darkest chapter of his life. In interviews, he began hinting that the song had served its purpose. Writing it had been his way of surviving, but singing it over and over was keeping him trapped in grief. In 2004, Clapton made his decision. At 46, he announced he would no longer perform Tears in Heaven. He explained simply that he didn't need to stay connected to that pain anymore. For fans, it was a shock. To many, the song defined him more than his legendary guitar work. How could he walk away from it? But to Clapton, the choice was about survival. He could not keep tearing himself open for others. Once Clapton retired Tears in Heaven from his shows, his life began to change. He poured more energy into family and leaned back into the blues traditions that had shaped his youth. On stage, he still moved crowds, but without the shadow of the ballad hanging over him. Critics quickly weighed in. Some praised the move, saying it took courage to let go of such a massive hit. Others admitted disappointment. They wanted to keep hearing the song live, but Clapton stood firm. His concerts sold out regardless. His reputation as one of the greatest guitarists alive remained untouchable, and in a way his silence gave the song even greater weight. People began to realize that by choosing not to perform it, Clapton had turned it into something sacred. For him, stepping away wasn't forgetting Connor. It was a way of honoring his son privately, while choosing to live in the present with the family still around him. Even after Clapton retired, Tears in Heaven from his live shows, the song never truly left him or the world. The recording became one of the most played tracks of the 1990s. Radio stations aired it constantly, television networks used it during tributes, and fans adopted it as a soundtrack to their own grief. Funerals, memorials, church services, Tears in Heaven became the universal language of loss. For many, it was impossible to separate the song from their own lives. People said it was the first song they turned to when tragedy struck, and Clapton, though silent on stage, was never far from it. On rare occasions, he did bring it back, but only for moments that carried deep meaning. Sometimes it was a benefit concert, other times a tribute event. Each time his voice seemed softer, more fragile, as though the years had layered more memory onto every line. Fans who were present at those rare performances said the atmosphere was electric, almost reverent. It wasn't just another track on a set list, it was as if everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something precious, something that might never happen again. Still, Clapton resisted making it a regular part of his shows again. He treated it with distance, a kind of sacred respect. By limiting when it was performed, he ensured it kept its weight. To fans, those rare glimpses were unforgettable. To Clapton, they were enough to honor Connor's memory without letting grief consume him night after night. The song lived on in recordings and in the lives of those who carried it with them. In many ways, it became larger than Clapton himself. Clapton often said that what saved him in the years after Connor's death wasn't fame, fortune, or even music. It was family. In his later years, he became the father of daughters, Ruth, Julie Rose, Ella, and Sophie. Raising them gave him a sense of purpose that touring and awards never could. He described in interviews how the ordinary rhythms of family life grounded him, the morning school run, cooking meals, and quiet evenings at home. For a man who had lived decades surrounded by chaos, addiction, fame, and heartbreak, these simple routines were a gift. Fatherhood gave him perspective on his relationship with Tears in Heaven. Writing it had saved him once. Performing it had connected him with millions. But with his daughters growing up around him, he realized that his focus couldn't remain on the loss that nearly destroyed him. It had to shift to the life still in front of him. Clapton chose to honor Connor privately, through memory and family rituals, rather than through constant public performances. He explained that his son would always be with him, but that grief couldn't be the center of his identity forever. For fans, it looked like silence. For Clapton, it was healing. By letting go of the song on stage, he wasn't closing the door on Connor, he was opening space for the children who needed him now. Even without being performed live, Tears in Heaven became Clapton's most enduring ballad. Critics praised it as his most vulnerable and human work, stripping away the guitar hero image of the 1960s and 70s to reveal a father's grief. Rolling Stone and other outlets listed it among his greatest achievements, but the song's legacy was complicated. Some argued that audiences had asked too much of Clapton, turning his tragedy into performance. Others said the power of music comes from precisely that act, sharing private pain publicly. Either way, Tears in Heaven overshadowed much of Clapton's other work. For many people, it became the first song they thought of when his name came up, not Layla.
Begging, darling, please, darling,
Not Wonderful Tonight,
you look wonderful tonight.
not the blues solos that made him famous, but the ballad born from loss. For Clapton, that truth was both painful and powerful. The song that cost him the most became the song that defined him to the world. By stepping away from Tears in Heaven, Clapton created a paradox. He no longer performed it, yet it never disappeared. The MTV Unplugged version became one of the most replayed live recordings in music history. The song circulated endlessly on radio, streaming platforms, and tribute playlists. Clapton continued with his career, recording blues records, collaborating with fellow legends, and filling arenas. But journalists always circled back to one question: would he ever play Tears in Heaven again? His answer was consistent: no, the song belonged to the past. Ironically, his silence gave the song even more power. Fans began to see each recording as a frozen moment in time, a confession too raw to repeat. Knowing that Clapton himself had chosen not to revisit it made the existing performances feel almost sacred. And so Tears in Heaven became timeless, not because it was sung endlessly, but because it wasn't. By letting it go, Clapton preserved its purity. Today, the song endures as a universal hymn of grief and love. For fans, it remains the soundtrack to loss. For Clapton, it was once a lifeline, later a burden, and finally, a chapter he chose to close. In the end, the silence surrounding Tears in Heaven spoke louder than the song itself. When Eric Clapton finally told the world he could no longer perform Tears in Heaven, it wasn't with fireworks or headlines. It slipped out in quiet words during interviews, said in the same soft, almost reluctant tone that carried through the song itself. But those few words struck with the force of a final chord. The announcement echoed louder than any guitar solo. Here was a man who had survived fame, addiction, and decades of the music industry. Yet the one thing he could not conquer was his own grief. Fans didn't just hear a rock legend stepping away from a ballad. They heard a father admitting that the wound had never truly healed, and that singing the song was like reopening it every night. Clapton explained that Tears in Heaven had served its purpose. In the immediate years after Connor's death, it had been a lifeline. Writing it gave him somewhere to put the pain. Performing it allowed him to share that grief with others who understood. But as time went on, he realized the song had become something else entirely, a chain. Every lyric dragged him back to the 53rd floor in New York, to the day that changed his life forever. By the time he was 46, Clapton had entered a new phase of life. He was a father again, raising daughters who needed his love and presence. Singing Tears in Heaven no longer helped him heal. It kept him from living fully in the present. He admitted openly that he couldn't do it anymore. The song was too painful to keep alive on stage. For the public, the decision was both shocking and deeply moving. Many struggled with it. How could Clapton walk away from the song that had touched millions and won him 3 Grammy Awards? Yet others saw the truth in his silence. By letting go of the song, Clapton wasn't betraying his son's memory. He was honoring it, choosing to carry Connor in his heart rather than on a stage. The last times he performed the song live, fans described the air in the room as electric and fragile, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something that might never happen again. Some said the silence that followed his final notes was more powerful than the applause. It wasn't just the end of a performance. It felt like the closing of a wound, a goodbye to a chapter that had shaped him but could not define him forever, and yet questions remained. Did Clapton feel relief, finally free from the constant demand to relive his pain? Or did he feel guilt, knowing the world still longed for the song he had locked away? He never gave a clear answer, leaving the mystery unresolved, but one truth became undeniable. Tears in Heaven no longer needed to be sung to be alive. Clapton's silence turned it into something eternal, a frozen confession that carried its own weight in every recording, every tribute, every whisper of the opening line. And in that silence, the song became bigger than Clapton himself. It became immortal. In the end, Eric Clapton's choice to step away from Tears in Heaven wasn't about music at all. It wasn't about set lists, chart positions, or public expectations. It was about survival. He had written the song to put his grief into something tangible, something that could carry the weight he couldn't carry alone. And it worked, at least for a time. But once it had done its job, Clapton realized he couldn't keep living inside it. To keep singing it would mean staying trapped in the past, reliving March 20, 1991, again and again. To let it go meant moving forward, not because he forgot, but because he remembered too well. By setting the song down, Clapton honored both his son's memory and his own need to heal. The public had mixed feelings. Many longed to hear it again. Others admired his courage. Over time, the world accepted his decision, and the song itself took on a new role. It became timeless, existing outside of live performance, carried by recordings and memories. For Clapton, family became the new focus. His daughters gave him purpose. Music returned as joy, as tradition, as the blues he had always loved. And though Tears in Heaven would forever follow him, it no longer defined him. Sometimes the most powerful act isn't holding on, it's letting go. Eric Clapton may never sing Tears in Heaven the way he once did, but maybe that's the point. Some songs aren't meant to be performed forever. Some are meant to live in a single moment, carrying a truth so heavy that it only needs to be said once. And that's why this story still matters. Not just as music history, but as a reminder of what it means to love, to lose, and to keep going. What do you think? Was Clapton right to put the song down, or should he have kept sharing it with the world? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this move you, if you want to uncover the untold truths behind the songs that shaped our lives, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and ring the bell. There are so many more stories waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Because sometimes, the silence speaks louder than the music.